posters and with the program so far. So we are now on the final stretch for today. And we're going to end the day with a really amazing panel. Thank you. Big thank you to the guests here. So we have Marion Koopmans, who is the head of the Erasmus University Medical Center Department of Neuroscience in Rotterdam. We have William Pauw, who's the head of pharma research and early development at Roche. We have Bettina Ernst. She's the co-founder and CEO of Preclin Biosystems. She's also a vice chair on the InnoSwiss Innovation and Council, and she's part of the steering committee also of this national research program. And we have Giacomo Grasselli, who is a pathophysiologist at the University of Milan, and he's also on the steering committee of this NRP. So I want to get going, and I want to address my first question to you, Marion. Again, thanks for being here also on such short notice. You have been to China on this WHO mission, this famous one. Can you just give us a little bit of insight on what you learned there? I mean, the report is out. We can all go and read it, and I think many of us have. But also from your personal and professional perspective, what you took away from it and what you think we know now that we didn't know before, and what that means for the next steps.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So the mission really was about trying to dig down and walk back from the first notified cases in Wuhan to try and understand, well, eventually to try and understand what happened, where did this come from, and what led to this pandemic. So and that was done through a whole series of studies that were really looking at, can we find evidence for the earliest circulation, earliest cases? And so what we learned is that there was considerable circulation in December, leading to really a peak of mortality early in January. So, if you count back, so widespread circulation in December, but really through a series of quite intricate studies, no evidence for widespread circulation before that. That doesn't rule it out, because you can still have small pockets, but certainly not, months and months before that, not in that region. So that's one. Second is that the market that really was at the core of the initial reporting, there clearly has been amplification, but it's not the whole story. So the earliest cases identified and the viruses sequences from those cases is already some diversity. So we know that not everything has been grasped there, so that you need to go further back. And the third thing is that there was sales of, risk animal species on the market, some live and also dead frozen meat. And the tracking back the supply chain, so that was done for 1,500 stalls, quite a lot of work. The supply chain really also traced back to some wildlife farms in regions where we know the closest viruses were found in bats. So that is really what the package was. So circulation in December, leads for where to go next, and no conclusive evidence. On the animal side, more than, I think, 60,000 screening assays were done for a range of animals, no smoking gun, which is remarkable. With MERS, we've done just a screening 1,000 animals, and boom, there was the dromedary camel. It could have been It could have happened like that, but despite all this quite extensive screening, no smoking gun yet about an intermediary reservoir. So that's still a big question mark.
All right, good, and yeah, we'll hopefully learn more about that in the coming months. Yeah. So then this thing obviously starts spreading around the world. Lots of hospitals are at the front line of all of this. And so my next question goes to Giacomo. Giacomo, thanks for being here. I hope you can hear me and you're here. Please give me a signal that that's the case and that you can. That you
yes,
can,
yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Hear you.
So excellent. You have obviously been there at the forefront. So what's your sense there in terms of the response from the healthcare system and of the intensive care in general? What do you think? What are the sort of lessons learned for let's say future waves if we stick to this pandemic, and B, the next pandemic, especially also, I think, in light of what I heard in a breakout session today, that the role of healthcare workers was actually still quite important also both in preventing transmission, but also in transmission. Can you give us some insight from Milan?
Yeah, well, we've been the first region of the Western world hit by the pandemic, because our first Italian case was diagnosed on February 20, and it's been a real shock for us, and like for everyone in the world, and we had to face a really unprecedented and unexpected number of critically ill patients. So to give you an idea, we had to more than double our ICU capacity, and only in the region of Lombardy, it's 10 million people, which is probably the richest region in Italy and one of the richest regions in Europe. We have admitted since February 20 of last year almost 12,000 patients in the ICU in a year. So we learned many things. Unfortunately, politicians, hospital administration didn't learn, I think, the same amount of things. In Italy, we've gone through like 20 years of cuts to the budget of healthcare system. So we've had a huge reduction in the number of beds, not only ICU beds, but hospital beds, for example. And this has been a real problem. So we really had to open ICU beds like everywhere. And then the government released a decree stating that we have to double the ICU beds in like 1 year. But again, one ICU bed is not a bed with a ventilator and a monitor, but you need also people who can, work at the bedside and trained people. So this is I think that our system will completely change after the pandemic, and we will have to think of a different model of hospital, for example, and we will have to implement training of the people and keep people trained. And with regards to what we were saying about, healthcare workers in transmitting the disease, it's extremely important to have enough personal protective equipment and to learn how to use them and keep trained on that, because then when this will be over, I know that for sure the hospitals will in some way not pay so much attention to, again, having enough PPEs available and having people trained on their use. And this is very important. We may think of hospital areas or pavilions, let's say dormant, that you can open in case of new waves. We've had temporary ICUs in the expo areas, fully equipped with people going from the hospital to there. This has been a lot criticized, but we used them during these waves. I don't know. I think that after all this, we will have to sit down and reorganize the ideas and think of a new model of healthcare system.
Yep. Good, thank you. So that's, yeah, you've been obviously there at the forefront in Europe, and I quite remember, of course, and I think everyone remembers this massive call for getting to the bottom of this and testing, and basically an extremely limited supply of tests. And that brings me to our next guest on the panel, William Pao from Roche. Thanks very much for joining us. So William, obviously Roche is a big player in the diagnostics business also. I mean, infectious diseases have been, I guess, less and less of a focus in the pharmaceutical landscape. Roche has always been strong in diagnostics. How do you see this pandemic changing that landscape, and what does it mean also for a company like Roche in terms of the research and product development?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. I think in terms of what it means, I think what's incredible is the pace of science that happened last year, right? I mean, we didn't even know about the virus till basically on the sequence till January of last year. And then by the end of the year, we already had multiple products for detection. It might have seemed slow at the beginning, but still, looking at the glass half full, we had multiple detection methods, PCR, antigen tests, antibodies. We now have at least 5 vaccines, multiple cocktails, and additional agents in development. So the pace of R&D is really accelerating. I think what you're asking specifically is what does it mean for investment in infectious diseases? Actually, Roche PRED, the group that I'm in, has always had an infectious disease unit, including development of antibiotics for multi-drug resistant bacteria. I think we're one of 2 big pharma companies left, but we feel it's very, very important, and it's a huge unmet medical need out there. And we think there are new breakthroughs to be had, so we continue to invest in that. But I think the rest of the industry, we all have woken up and realized that we need to be much better prepared for respiratory viruses in general. There's been an amazing amount of collaboration across the industry during this period. And there's even discussion now and actually formation of a multi-pharma group of which Roche will be a part, but many others, to basically get prepared for the next pandemic, which is to have multiple antivirals available, sort of hopefully on the shelf, at least ready, to develop as soon as something comes. Now, of course, we can't anticipate exactly what will come, but I think we all anticipate that there will be another virus, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, I share that view, and I think we all do. Now, one of the players, obviously, so you're a big player. There's many small players, and Bettina Ernst, who's also here with us on the panel. Bettina, thanks for joining. You're part of InnoSwiss, but of course, you're also a founder and the CEO of a smaller biotech company. Can you tell us a little bit how that experience was from your side of the scale, let's say, of companies, and how you see an event like COVID-19, what that means for smaller biotech companies?
Yes. Great questions. I'm involved in several biotech companies, and I think we need to distinguish the 2 parts of the pandemic. The very early stage in the pandemic, when we were really in an emergency situation. This was March and April last year. I think at that time it was a human obligation to do whatever is in one's capability to do to serve mankind. Whatever technology you had at hand, if you can apply it, do apply it, independent of the cash it takes or whatever you have behind you. You had an obligation. Then we entered into the second phase of the pandemic, which was June to September, when we have first seen the first successes of the Regeneron antibodies. We have also seen first successes of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. And I think then each company had to regroup and to consider, is it too risky? And do the shareholders and investors support a pivot into COVID or not? So these were the two phases that were happening in a biotech.
Thank you. So this is very interesting, right? I mean, there's multiple actors here from different systems, all tied to the science, and all trying to figure out as quickly as possible how can we leverage this. How can we leverage the insight and the knowledge that's around? And Marian, I want to ask you there in Switzerland. I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody, but my sense has been that in the beginning there was a certain, how should I put this most diplomatically, frustration regarding the link between academic research and public health authorities. Lots of bridges seem to be needing to be built first. In the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken, you have a very strongly established collaboration between academic research and the public health authorities. If I remember this correctly. I mean, A, is that correct? And B, would you say that has actually helped you in your response? And C, if you have time, what would you recommend the Swiss research community and public health authorities to do for the next time? Sorry, lots of questions.
Okay, well, I don't know the Swiss situation, but I can tell you that we've had our share of frustrations. But I think that's part of the whole thing. I think pandemic preparedness has been a public health thing to do instead of, and I think if you really, one of the lessons learned here is just how far away clinical research and academic research has been from this core public health preparedness. Academic groups working on preparedness aside. So that divide, I think, has been part of the problem. So this not thinking in terms of scaling up and what have you. So we do have a tradition of collaborations. We have apparently made it look good from the outside, but yes, there certainly were similar struggles. But that's exactly where I think we need to learn. So I was really intrigued by, so that we've seen the earliest situation in Italy. We talk about diagnostics. Do we now, are we going to invest in catch-all diagnostics? That because it is completely understandable that clinical centers are not prepared for everything that's out there because it's just too daunting. But can we then maybe develop tools to have sort of a permanent monitor in a clinical context rather than thinking about this from a public health perspective only? So I think we have to learn how to, so which elements to bridge between these worlds. And then if it comes to epidemic research, I myself have been playing at both ends of the fence. So, and I still remember that it is, in academia, of course, you're more free to move, free to think, free to just conclude. In a public health context, there is this context to deal with. If you put out recommendations, you have to make sure that the mayors, that you have buy-in, that you don't go against something that at the level of the government has been decided. So or at least it's more of a tightrope walking. So it's understandable that there's tension there, but I do think again that this partnership is critical. It's clear.
Yeah. William, question to you regarding partnership. So what, if you now look back, or rather also maybe to the future, right? What in terms of partnership between academic research and industry like Roche, where do you think we would have the biggest lever to do things better, in the coming years? What needs to be done here? What's the learning? What's the lessons learned?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am also on ACTIVE, which is a committee chaired by Francis Collins, the head of NIH, in response to COVID. And he co-chairs it with another pharma person. And then it brings together pharma, government, academia, all together, NIH, et cetera. I think the biggest learning is that we need better coordination on trials. So at one point we calculated in the US, I forget exactly what the numbers were, but I think we calculated there were like 2,000 COVID trials going on. But Janet Woodcock from the FDA, or she was at that time on Warp Speed, basically said only 10% were actually decision-making for approval. So we had a ton of investigators, a ton of sites putting patients on studies, which ultimately would lead to nowhere, but maybe a publication. I was a previous academic, so I totally appreciate that. But in a pandemic, we need to all come together and try to answer a question as quickly as possible. And there has to be a better way to do that, whether they're platform studies or whether we prioritize which molecules get tested first. But I do think we could have reached earlier conclusions about what's going to work and what's not going to work by having much better coordination across all academic sites, including pharma and the government.
So in how much is that also a funding question? Because there's been massive funding slushed around, but of course, not necessarily, to the decisive trials, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, even at Roche, we were trying to test Actemra, which is an IL-6 receptor monoclonal antibody. It's an immunomodulator. We were trying to see if it was useful for patients to basically prevent death once they were hospitalized. We had investigators that would try to prioritize their own trials versus the trial that we were trying to answer the question. So, we were even competing at sites with local investigators on their own trials. So again, totally get the point that people want to publish and people want to get their name out there. But in a pandemic, I think we need to prioritize what's important and getting to the answers quickly.
Bettina, I want to have the question also to you. I mean, this is the famous gap, of course, we often speak about, right? Research and getting stuff out, also obviously through industry. And there's this famous valley of death. And that's, of course, even worse in a fast-moving situation like a pandemic. You are at the InnoSwiss Innovation Council, and InnoSwiss, of course, was specifically also created in Switzerland to gap that valley. What's having been in this situation now, can you give us a short sort of summary of what you see and what's been working and what's not been working and needs to be changed and how?
I mean, I still see what is not working now. I think there are really companies out there with really could make a huge difference in this pandemic. Biotech companies, and that just have not the funding, to move ahead, because I think also all the investors are, they supported at the beginning, maybe, put extra money for an effort because it was an ethical obligation to serve, to support. But also this comes once at the end, and now there would really be for some companies public funding, but this could not even Swiss carry. Swiss cannot stem, the cost for clinical trials, the cost 2 to 10 millions. This is over a Swiss budget, but I think Swiss helped that some of the early stage biotech biotech companies could survive during this period with some of the, facilitating of the grants that they were providing, but they were a facilitator, but cannot solve the issue. They have not the means to do that.
Mm-hmm. So the question also goes to Giacomo. I mean, I think a lot of the research questions are sort of coming up almost in, one by one, and in very quick sort of serial fashion. I mean, now, at least in Switzerland, of course, a huge question mark with respect to research is long COVID, or whatever you want to call it, the long-term effects of this virus. How do you do this in Milan, or maybe in Italy more generally, in making sure that extremely rapidly developments that you see also in the hospital can quickly be sort of tackled from a research perspective? Is that easy to do or rather hard to do? What are the roadblocks? You're still on mute, Giacomo.
Yeah, sorry. So the issue is extremely important, and many centers in Italy are now organizing follow-up programs for the patients to disclose long-term outcome and long-term consequences of COVID-19, especially on the respiratory system, but not only, because we know that we have long-term neurological and neuropsychological problems in those patients. So there's a lot of many programs of follow-up, still very limited data, and what is very important is that we don't know how the treatment we are implementing now, not only pharmacological treatment, but for example, ventilation treatment can impact on the long-term respiratory consequences of the disease. I've chaired in the breakout session the project by Pöllinger, for example, and one of the aims of this project, which is trying to develop an artificial intelligence algorithm, putting together different omics from radiology to lab data to clinical data, is to learn which patients are at highest risk for the development of long-term outcomes of COVID-19, because these may have a major impact on the society, let's say, on the public health or global health of the people. So it's very important, and I still think that research is not too much focused on that. So I think that we are testing hundreds, thousands of drugs in a very huge number of maybe small trials, as people were saying before. But we are, I don't know if this so huge number of small pharmacological trials will give us relevant answers on the important topics, and long-term outcomes are certainly very important for the disease, because we still don't know many things about this disease. And talking to my colleagues, I hear different experience even from center to center. There are people who say, okay, we see people 6 months after discharge, we take a CT scan, it's perfectly normal. Other people, they say, well, our patient come back and we take the CT scan, and all of them have abnormal findings at CT scan. So there's many things that we do not understand, and I think that it's more complicated than giving a drug or not, and randomizing patients, and then looking at one relevant clinical outcome, short-term outcome. This is more general for all critically ill patients, because in the ICU we know that patients have long-term outcomes, not only short-term, which is ICU or hospital mortality.
Yeah. Yep. Makes sense. Okay, I want to make one last round and essentially want to ask all of you kind of the same question. I guess in terms of 2021 and what we're supposed to do and what we're planning to do, it's more or less in the bank, so to speak, unless of course there's a huge surprise coming our way, which we never know these days. And also, right, this research project, this research program is targeted to last for 24 months. So what is the one thing that you think we should do beyond that horizon, where it seems like, of course, if you look sort of into 5-10 years, yes, right, we should do everything to prevent the next pandemic. And short term, we should do everything to end this one. But what about that phase in between, right? What's the thing we should really try to do mostly, both either from a research or industry perspective? I'll let you choose. Bettina, why don't you go ahead and start that?
Yes, I think, I mean, there were some important learnings during this pandemic, and I think it was the fast-track regulatory approvals that has occurred at the FDA. I think if this can be copied to everyday life, then the cost of drugs could be really reduced. In addition, I think the coordination of clinical trials, as William Pohl has mentioned before, it should become also an example for oncology, for example, for other indication. This will also reduce cost for drug development in future. And then I think a wish or a focus that we should have in, let's say, next generation vaccine development is that we can approve a backbone structure of a vaccine that can be quickly adapted to whatever mutant strain arises, in order that it can have a very rapid time from integrating this mutation of the vaccine into the people that need it.
Thank you. Marion?
I think my priority would go to sustainable vaccine response. So with or without variants, most likely with, but also what happens if you do repeated boosters with your vector vaccines? Are we going to need to switch them around? Can mRNA vaccines be made cold chain proof, or independent? So we really can vaccinate the world, because I think that's where I see the biggest challenge, that we may 2 years from now find ourselves with very different epidemiological situations across the globe, and that will continue to fuel new variants and a continued challenge globally. So that's where my first choice would be. Let's vaccinate the world, and let's figure out what is needed to get there.
Mm-hmm. Good. William, what's your view on this question?
I'll take the optimistic view and assume that what Bettina and Marion said are going to happen, and just emphasize that there's still lots of other disease out there. And unfortunately, during this period, patients have delayed diagnosis of cancer. They've come in with much later disease. They've not treated their Alzheimer's, other illnesses, diabetes, etc. And so, assuming we're going to get this virus under control, let's not forget that there's many other diseases that still need to be treated, and we need to pay attention to.
Great, thank you. And Giacomo, your view on this?
Well, I have to say that I agree with all have been said until now. From the research point of view, I hope that we will learn to, how can I say, establish larger research networks, share data, share protocol. work together, because again, we need to move to a more global perspective on this. Everyone is trying to vaccinate more people in his country, and then everyone is saying, okay, now we've vaccinated all the country and the problem is gone. But clearly, if you look at the number of cases in the world, you see them growing every day. So it's we need to think of this disease as a global disease. It's not only a problem of the third wave in Italy or the fourth wave in India, or it's people move around, which is why we will have new pandemics, for example. And we have seen it. It's now, yesterday in Italy on the newspaper, everyone big titles because we have 2 cases of an Indian variant in Italy. But what? You know how many people have come and gone from India in the last, I don't know, 1 month? So it's just we outside. We need to open up our minds and to think more globally. If we don't, as Marian was saying, if we don't vaccinate all the people, especially in the poor countries, now the sun is coming back, and we will have again boats full of migrants coming from Africa to Italy, and it's you cannot you cannot switch off a fire with a bottle of water. We really need to put our efforts together and to think of a more global perspective also from the research point of view. We are having responses from the big adaptive trials, not really from the small trials on 200 patients in a country which has special characteristics of the patients, of the care. It's very difficult to compare what's happening in the States to what happens in India or in Brazil.
Yep, thank you. It's a globalized world, it's a globalized problem, and we need a global solution. I think that's a very good point and a great, exactly. We call it pandemic for a reason. That's what I said also back in February when the WHO still wouldn't call it a pandemic. I was also wondering, what else do you need? Good. Well, thank you very much. That was extremely insightful. I'm sorry for the extremely short time, but we have to end it here. I want to thank all of you for participating on this first day. I want to thank also Mark Becher and his team, as Kim Hum, Antonio Semler, Siri Brooker from Life Science Communication for the technical support. I know it's not easy. These things always look easy on Zoom and on GatherTown, but I've been on many meetings where it doesn't work, and then you know how important such a team is. Also from the National Science Foundation, Pascal Walter, the program manager, Julien Jacquier, Barbara Blatter, and Yolanda Curleto and Noel Rodenburg for making a really smooth event today. We're back tomorrow.